In a public company, you have two classes of shareholders, an equity and a preference shareholders. Of course, there can be classes within the preference shareholder, different classes of preference, but they are a class by themselves. Now, between the equity and a preference shareholder, we have to take into account that the preference shareholder has got a preferential right of dividend. Secondly, he has also got a preferential right of return of capital. And since his capital is not at risk, therefore, it is the equity shareholder who ought to be given a greater say in the affairs of the company than the preference shareholder. Because the equity shareholder takes the maximum risk in the success or failure of the company. Now, it is an artificial person and it has to act through the natural person. Now, can it act through the natural person, that is the shareholder? Theoretically, there is no prohibition in doing it, but then the advantage of having a company is taken away. One of the purposes of having a company is that the shareholder can be separated from the day-to-day affairs of the company, and its management can be given to a professional body which will manage the day-to-day affairs of the company. The natural, so in this particular way, the company is different from the partnership. Now, company has to act through a natural person who will have been charge of the day-to-day affairs of that particular company. That particular body which is in charge of the day-to-day affairs of the company are the directors, and the body of directors is the board of directors. They are selected by the shareholders as per the Companies Act and Articles of Association. Now, though they have been selected by the shareholders, they represent the company and not the shareholders. This is an important distinction which we have to take into account, that they represent the interests of the company and not of the shareholders. The implications of this particular distinction is that in certain circumstances, for the interest of the company, they can take decisions which might not be in the interest of the shareholders as such. Now, what is the relationship between the shareholders, the board of directors and the company? The shareholders and the board of directors are two organs of the company. They speak for the company and they act for the company. The distribution of powers are dependent upon the Companies Act and Articles of Association. First, let us look into what are the powers which are vested in the shareholders. What are their rights and what of the shareholders? There can be three sets of rights which are vested in the shareholders. One, which is provided to them by the Companies Act. Second set is that which has been reserved for them by the Articles of Association. The third set relates to those which the shareholders by voting have reserved from themselves. Now, rights which have been reserved for shareholders by the Companies Act will depend on the nature of the companies. A greater degree of rights are reserved for the shareholders in the public companies as against those reserved for a shareholder in a private company. The reason is obvious. The shareholder never had the opportunity to provide for rights to himself in the Articles of Association to protect himself from the majority decision. Rights which have been reserved for the shareholders will relate to different types of situations. So, first type is which relate to the oversight by the shareholder of the board. So, approving the accounts of the company, deciding of the auditors of the company, these are the methods by which the shareholder oversees the board of directors, what it is doing, how it is affecting its interests. So, these rights have to be reserved in favor of the shareholders. Second type of situation relate to where there can be a conflict of interest between the board and the interests of the company. So, oversight has to be given to the shareholder in such a situation. So, in such situations, the shareholder will have to decide whether the second type of a situation relate to where there might be a conflict of interest between that of the company and that of the board of directors. That, like, for example, the related party transactions. In related party transactions, the shareholder has to be given an opportunity to decide whether the transaction has to be entered into or not, because the decision of the board cannot be relied upon. The third type of a situation where the shareholder has to be given its powers leads to where he has to be made aware of the nature of risks and its implications. Take, for example, the sale of an undertaking, merger of a company with another company. These are situations which will have implications on the value of the share, and it has a bearing on the risks which the company, which the undertaking will be subject to. Then there are rights and powers which are reserved by the shareholders for themselves in the articles of association of the company. Now, the shareholders may reserve additional decision-making powers for themselves in the articles of association. They might also, while reserving for rights for themselves, provide for stiffer norms by which one can say that the shareholders have approved a particular action, and they might provide also for a special powers to one of the shareholders or a body of the shareholders. As far as the powers which are given to the board are concerned, those powers might flow, certain sets of powers will flow from the Companies Act. The reason why certain sets of powers will flow from the Companies Act is because the Companies Act recognizes that in certain situations the duties of the board might be in conflict with the interest of the shareholders. So, in a situation where the duties of the board might be in conflict with the interests of the shareholders, the powers have to be given to the board so that they override the shareholders in that situation. Then powers might be given to the board or to a committee of the board by the articles of association of the company. And lastly, shareholders might delegate certain powers to the board by voting. Now, powers given to the board by articles. As we know, the articles of association is a contractual document among the shareholders. Since it's a contractual document amongst the shareholders, therefore, what the powers which have been given to the board is something which is binding not only just upon the board, but it is binding upon the shareholders too. The shareholders cannot take away from the board of directors that which has been given by them to it without amending the articles. Even though the shareholders as a body might differ from the board by a majority large enough to amend the articles. But till they have amended the articles, it is the board which shall exercise that particular power. Now, also one factor we have to take into account that shareholder does not mean just the majority of the shareholders. It means all the shareholders. And some of the shareholders might differ from the decision of the majority. Also, certain rights might be given to the minority shareholders, and those rights cannot be taken away by the majority of the shareholders. So, if the board of directors decision is subject to the view of one particular shareholder, if one board of directors view is subject to if the board of directors decision is subject to the view of one director nominated by a particular shareholder, it cannot be that the shareholders as a body can override that particular view of the board of directors, because this is a right which has been given to a particular shareholder. The majority, if at the initial stage, has reserved a right for one individual shareholder or one individual shareholder or a director nominated by him, then the majority cannot take it away without amending the articles. Another aspect which we have to also to take into account is that if the power has been given to the board of directors, then another aspect which we have to take into account is that the articles of association is a public document. The public is aware of the decision making structure of the company through this particular document. So if the shareholders seek to impose their view upon the view of the board of directors, then there would be a confusion in the public concern.